Earth's skies darkened as the colossal alien fleet of the Zarnok emerged from the void, their ships blocking out the sun and casting a shadow over the world humanity had fought so hard to protect. A sense of dread swept across the planet's surface as millions of eyes turned toward the heavens waiting for the inevitable strike to come. The Zarnok had arrived with a force unlike anything humanity had ever faced, their ships massive beyond comprehension, and their weapons capable of reducing entire cities to rubble in mere moments. Humanity had been at peace for generations, unaware that a storm was brewing in the stars. The Zarnok had razed countless worlds before reaching Earth, leaving nothing but ruins in their wake. They were known for their ruthless efficiency in war, their technology far surpassing anything humanity had ever achieved. They were a species that viewed others not as equals, but as prey, and Earth was no exception. The first wave of attacks was swift and brutal. Entire cities were destroyed before the world's leaders could even react. Panic spread like wildfire. Governments fell into chaos as the global defense systems were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the assault. Military forces scrambled to mount a defense, but it was clear that humanity's conventional weapons were no match for the Zarnok's devastating firepower. As Earth's defenses crumbled and the skies burned with the fires of war, the people of Earth looked to their leaders for guidance. But there was none to be found. The high command of the human fleet was in disarray, with no clear strategy to fight back against an enemy that seemed invincible. Desperate measures were being discussed in the war rooms of every nation, but each plan seemed doomed to failure. Even as the Zarnok's ships closed in on Earth's atmosphere, no one had any illusions about what was to come. The Zarnok would not negotiate, they would not surrender. They had come to conquer and destroy. But amidst the despair, a single voice rose above the rest. Admiral Sarah Mitchell stood at the forefront of humanity's military leadership, a woman forged by countless battles and the horrors of war. She had seen her fair share of defeat, but she had also seen the indomitable spirit of humanity in the face of insurmountable odds. And she would not let her people fall without a fight. In the face of certain annihilation, she called for a last-ditch counteroffensive, rallying a fleet of human warships that were barely capable of defending Earth's remaining cities. But her message was clear: humanity would not go down without a fight, even if the odds were impossible. Even if the Zarnok fleet was beyond anything Earth could muster, they would stand. And they would make the invaders pay for their arrogance. As Admiral Mitchell prepared her forces for the desperate mission ahead, the world watched with bated breath, knowing that the fate of their species rested in the hands of a few hundred brave souls who dared to defy the darkness of the cosmos. As Admiral Sarah Mitchell prepared to lead humanity's final stand against the Zarnok invasion, the weight of the task ahead pressed heavily on her shoulders. She stood on the bridge of the flagship Valor, staring out at the approaching alien fleet, its sheer size almost impossible to comprehend. 1,000 warships stretching across the sky, each one a symbol of the Zarnok's might and ruthlessness. The human fleet was a fraction of their size, a small cluster of ships, barely enough to defend Earth, let alone confront the oncoming storm. Yet in the depths of her soul, Mitchell knew this was humanity's moment to prove their worth. She turned to her crew, every face before her a reflection of the fear and determination that gripped the hearts of every human who knew what was coming. They were all scared, but none of them were willing to abandon the fight. Not now, not ever. The communications officer spoke up, breaking the silence. Admiral, we've just received word from Earth's command. They'd authorized the use of experimental weapons. Mitchell nodded grimly. The human race was pulling out every stop to survive. It was a gamble, but it was their only hope. The weapon in question was a prototype built in secret beneath the surface of Earth, a relic from humanity's forgotten pasts, said to possess unimaginable power. It had been buried for centuries until now, when the need for such power became desperate. Her eyes flickered toward the screen showing Earth's surface. The planet was burning, cities reduced to ash, as Zarnok forces rained destruction from above. It was too late to save the majority of the population, but the survivors, scattered across the world, were rallying under the banner of resistance groups forming in the chaos, desperate for any chance to fight back. Captain, bring us into formation, she ordered, her voice firm, cutting through the tension. We have to buy time for the resistance to activate the weapon. Aye, Admiral, came the reply, As the ship's crew scrambled to carry out the orders, the fleet began to align itself ready for the first wave of combat. It was a suicide mission, but there was no other choice. Earth was dying, and humanity's only hope was to make the Zarnok feel the cost of their conquest. For the first time since the invasion began, the human fleet opened fire, their weapons no match for the Zarnok shields, but the attack was enough to grab the attention of the invaders. They were more than just an obstacle now, they were a challenge. And that's what the Zarnok feared. Humanity was unpredictable, and the human spirit could never be fully measured by their enemy's technology. The battle raged across the sky as human ships darted in and out of enemy fire, desperately trying to create an opening for the weapon to be activated. In the chaos of the battle, a small group of human fighters, led by Mitchell's elite squadron, broke through the Zarnok's outer defenses and made their way toward the heart of the enemy fleet. "We've reached the coordinates, Admiral," the squadron leader reported, his voice filled with tension. "Initiating the weapons sequence now." It was humanity's last chance to turn the tide. As Mitchell gripped the armrest of her chair, the fate of her species hung in the balance, and the odds remained as slim as ever. But in that moment, she had a single thought, a thought that kept her going even when everything seemed lost. Humanity would never stop fighting, they would never surrender. The human fleet pushed forward with a ferocity born of desperation, their fighters darting between the massive Zarnok ships, launching attacks that seemed hopeless, but still carried the weight of humanity's refusal to surrender. The fleet had already taken heavy casualties, but the survivors fought on, determined to hold the line long enough for the secret weapon to be activated. The Zarnok ships loomed above Earth like a dark cloud of doom, their weapons disintegrating anything in their path. But they had underestimated humanity's resilience. The Zarnok commander observed the battle from his flagship, his 6 eyes narrowing, as he watched the humans continue to resist in ways he had not anticipated. He had expected them to break under the pressure, yet here they were fighting back with reckless determination. It was as if they were willing to die for something far greater than survival. The commander barked orders to his officers, directing them to increase the firepower on the human ships, but still the humans held firm, each strike from their ships leaving its mark on the Zarnok forces. While the resistance on the ground escalated, it was clear that humanity would not be crushed so easily. Admiral Mitchell's eyes never left the battle screen. As the Valor sailed through enemy fire, she could feel the heat of each explosion that rocked her ship, yet she stood unwavering. As the command bridge erupted into chaos, her mind was focused on the task ahead. She had one chance to turn this around, and that chance was rapidly closing in. "Keep pushing forward," she commanded. "We cannot afford to let them regroup." The crew worked tirelessly around her, repairing systems and firing back at the Zarnok ships. But Mitchell's thoughts were on the surface of Earth. She had no idea if the weapon would work, or if it was even possible for it to activate in time. But they had no choice, they had to trust it. The Zarnok were relentless, their attacks showing no sign of slowing down as they attempted to break through the human defenses with precision and overwhelming force. Mitchell clenched her fists in frustration as she saw the Valor take another hit. Her mind raced with calculations. If the weapon was activated too early, it could destabilize Earth's atmosphere. But if it was delayed too long, the remaining fleet would be wiped out. The weapon had to be triggered at exactly the right moment, and they had no way of knowing if the human resistance on the surface could hold off the Zarnok long enough to ensure that moment came. The situation was dire, and the odds of success were slim. But one thing became abundantly clear as the battle raged on: the human will was unbreakable. And in this war of attrition, humanity's greatest weapon was not its ships or its technology, it was the undying determination of its people. With the seconds ticking down and Earth's future hanging in the balance, Mitchell turned to her crew and said one last thing before she turned back to the front lines. "We will make them feel our defiance." Her words were not just for her crew, but for every human soldier, every fighter, every resistance group, and every person on the ground who was risking everything to ensure that humanity would not be forgotten. Admiral Sarah Mitchell's grip tightened on the armrest of her chair as the Valor shook from another massive impact, her breath steady. But her mind was a whirlwind as she watched the battle unfold below. The enemy fleet was relentless, their ships were superior in firepower and numbers, Yet humanity refused to yield. Every ship that fell, every fighter that exploded was a testament to the unyielding spirit of the human race. They would not go down quietly. The Zarnok commander continued to observe the humans' tactics from his flagship, his 6 eyes narrowed in disbelief as they displayed a strange blend of creativity and reckless courage. It was unlike any species he had encountered before. He had expected them to break under pressure. But they held fast. They seemed to find new ways to fight back at every turn. This was no longer just a war of technology or numbers. It had become a war of willpower, and the Zarnok commander realized too late that human determination was not something his fleet could crush with brute force. He ordered his fleet to press harder now. Every weapon turned toward the remaining human ships, hoping to break their resolve. But it was already too late. Admiral Mitchell knew the moment of truth was upon them. The resistance groups on Earth had been working tirelessly to activate the weapon buried deep in the planet's core. They had been given only one shot to make it work. And if they failed, everything humanity had fought for would be lost. The communication officer's voice cut through the tense silence of the bridge. Admiral, the surface reports that the activation sequence has begun. Mitchell's heart skipped a beat as she stared at the comms screen. The weapon had been activated. Now they had to hold on long enough for it to reach full power. The Zarnok had underestimated the human ability to adapt, but they had also underestimated their capacity for sacrifice. Mitchell knew the odds were slim, but she still held onto the hope that the weapon would be their salvation. "Captain, bring us in closer to the enemy flagship." She ordered. The words felt almost absurd to speak as the Valor drifted through a battlefield filled with wreckage and fire, but there was no hesitation in her voice. "We have one shot at this. Make it count." "Admiral," came the reply, and the ship altered its course to head directly toward the heart of the Zarnok fleet. Mitchell watched as the gap between them closed. The Valor, shaking with each blast that grazed its hull, the ship's forward shields were already dangerously low. But they had no other option. They had to get close enough to allow the weapon to trigger fully before the Zarnok could retaliate. The Valor surged forward, as if propelled by the last ounce of humanity's strength. The commander of the Zarnok fleet saw the human flagship approaching with desperation and ordered every weapon to target it. He knew the risk now. If that ship reached the heart of his fleet, he would lose everything. And so the Zarnok unleashed their fury, hoping to prevent the inevitable. But Sarah Mitchell's gaze remained fixed on the forward screen, her mind focused on one singular thought: Earth's last hope would not be extinguished, not while there was a breath left in her body. The Valor pushed forward as the Zarnok fire intensified and the battle reached its crescendo. The moment of reckoning was close. The Valor shuddered under the intense barrage of enemy fire, the Zarnok weapons relentless in their pursuit of destruction. Admiral Mitchell gritted her teeth as the screens in front of her flickered from the force of the impacts. The ship was holding together, but just barely. Every second felt like an eternity, the entire crew working in unison to keep the ship from falling apart while still pushing forward. The Zarnok flagship loomed ahead, its immense size dwarfing even the Valor. But Mitchell knew this was their only chance. If they could breach the heart of the Zarnok fleet, humanity's weapon might have the power to tip the scales. But they had to survive long enough for it to reach full activation, shields at 15%. The tactical officer called out, his voice strained. "We won't last much longer at this rate." Mitchell's gaze never wavered from the forward screen. She knew the odds, but she had seen humanity overcome impossible odds before. And it wasn't fear that gripped her heart now. It was the burning determination to see this fight through. "We hold the line," she commanded, her voice steady despite the chaos. "Do not falter now." The ship lurched violently as another explosion rocked its hull, and the crew scrambled to keep systems online. Mitchell felt the Valor groan under the pressure, but she refused to let it break. She glanced to the side where her second-in-command, Lieutenant Hawkins, stood, his face a mask of resolve. "Are we close?" she asked through gritted teeth. Hawkins nodded, his face set in grim determination. "We're almost there, Admiral. The weapon should be fully activated in moments." Mitchell nodded. She knew that moment was coming, but she also knew it could all be over before they even got the chance to use it. The Zarnok commander, aboard his flagship, saw the human ship closing in, and he bellowed in rage. He had underestimated their resolve, and now it was too late to stop them. The Zarnok fleet turned their firepower on the Valor with everything they had, but the human ship pushed on through the storm of fire. Undeterred, each blast that hit it took its toll, but the Valor continued to forge ahead. Target the Zarnok flagship. Mitchell barked, her voice unwavering. We make this count. The crew scrambled to obey as the Valor surged forward one final time through the hail of enemy fire. We're in range. The weapons officer reported, firing on target. The Valor's weapons discharged in a brilliant burst of energy, slamming into the Zarnok flagship's shields. The alien vessel shuddered, but it remained intact. Mitchell's heart pounded as she watched the damage unfold. She had hoped for more. But there was no time to waste. Lieutenant, prepare to deploy the weapon. She ordered. Hawkins turned to the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys, his face set in concentration. Weapon deployment in progress. He confirmed. The ship shook once more as the weapon's final sequence began. But as the Valor surged closer to the Zarnok flagship, a sudden impact sent the entire bridge into chaos. Alarms blared across the ship as the lights flickered and power systems went offline. Mitchell was thrown from her chair as the entire ship lurched with a violent force. She could hear the screams of the crew over the blaring alarms. But her mind was focused on one thing. She had to make sure the weapon was deployed, no matter the cost. Get us back online now, she shouted as she scrambled to her feet. Hawkins was already at his post, his fingers moving frantically over the controls. We've lost all auxiliary power, Admiral, but the weapon is still online, he said with urgency. Mitchell nodded, blood running down her face from a cut above her eyebrow. Do it now, Lieutenant, she said through clenched teeth. In that moment, she knew the end was near. But she would not let humanity fall, not without a fight. The Valor groaned under the pressure of the Zarnok's relentless barrage systems, fading one by one, alarms shrieking throughout the ship. Yet Admiral Mitchell's focus never wavered as she clutched the armrest of her chair, her knuckles white. The ship was dying, but she would not let her people die with it. Lieutenant Hawkins, is the weapon deployed? Mitchell's voice cut through the chaos. Hawkins's hands flew over the console, his face drenched in sweat. The ship rocked again as another strike landed. We're almost there, Admiral. The weapon is just a few seconds from activation, he said, his voice tight with urgency. Mitchell's gaze remained locked on the forward screen, where the massive form of the Zarnok flagship loomed larger with each passing second. Her heart raced with anticipation. She had seen the reports from the surface. The resistance was holding their ground, but only barely. The activation sequence of the weapon had taken longer than expected, and now time was running out. The Zarnok were relentless in their pursuit of annihilation, and Mitchell's mind raced with the thought that they might not survive this moment. But humanity had always been at its strongest in the darkest hour, and now was no different. She would fight to the end, no matter the cost. The Zarnok commander on his flagship stayed at the human ship, closing in with disbelief. His fleet had pummeled the Valor for what seemed like an eternity, but still it pressed forward. His orders had been clear to wipe out the humans, and yet they refused to break. They were proving more difficult to crush than he had anticipated. The commander slammed his fist against the console in frustration. Why won't they fall, he muttered to himself, his voice low with frustration. The Zarnok knew that the humans had no hope of winning, but the commander was beginning to sense something greater was unfolding, as if the human fleet was doing something else entirely, something they had never seen before. Admiral Mitchell was now only a few hundred meters away from the heart of the Zarnok fleet. The Zarnok flagship loomed ahead, and Mitchell knew the moment of reckoning had come. Weapons officer, ready to fire. She called out, her voice sharp and clear. Aye, Admiral, came the response as the ship's last remaining weapons aligned. The crew was exhausted, their energy reserves low, but the Valor still had one final fight left in it. The weapons officer fired the remaining salvo into the Zarnok flagship. This time, the strike hit harder than before. The alien ship's shields flickered and weakened with a violent ripple. Mitchell watched with bated breath as the enemy flagship staggered under the force of the attack. But the fight was far from over. Target the power core, Mitchell ordered. We need to break their defenses wide open. The crew worked feverishly as they maneuvered the ship closer to the enemy flagship. The Zarnok fired back with fury, knowing that the human ship had become a serious threat. In the midst of this madness, Hawkins shouted, Admiral, the weapon has reached full power. Mitchell's breath caught in her chest. "Deploy it now," she ordered as the Valor took another strike from the Zarnok flagship. But this time it didn't matter. The weapon activated a surge of brilliant energy, erupted from the Valor's core, lighting up the sky. The weapon shot out in a massive beam of pure destructive force and slammed into the heart of the Zarnok fleet. The alien ships began to tremble and shudder as the energy cascaded through their systems. The Zarnok commander watched helplessly as his fleet faltered under the weapon's power. The tide of battle shifted in that single moment, and for the first time the Zarnok commander understood what the humans were capable of. They were not just fighting for survival, they were fighting for everything they had ever built. The Zarnok flagship shook violently as the blast from the human weapon tore through its defenses systems, flickering and sparking with every impact. The alien commander screamed in rage as he watched his flagship stagger under the weight of humanity's power. For the first time in the battle, he felt the true terror of what the humans could do. His fleet was faltering, and his control over the battlefield slipping with every passing second. The commander ordered his remaining ships to regroup, but it was already too late. The energy from the weapon had destabilized their shields and crippled their weapons. The Valor had pierced the heart of the Zarnok fleet, and now the battle was tipping in humanity's favor. Admiral Mitchell's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the chaos unfold on the screens before her. The weapon had worked far better than they had hoped. The Zarnok fleet was reeling from the blow, but there was no time to celebrate. The battle was far from won. The resistance on the surface had given everything they had to activate the weapon, and now it was up to the remaining human ships to finish what they had started. "Weapons officer, are we in range to fire again?" Mitchell's voice rang out with purpose. The officer glanced at the controls, his hands flying over the panel. "Yes, Admiral, the weapon is ready to fire again," he said, his voice tight with exhaustion, but also tinged with a fierce resolve. Mitchell nodded, her eyes never leaving the forward screen. "Target their flagship once more," she ordered. The Valor surged forward, moving through the debris and wreckage of the battle. As it made its way closer to the crippled Zarnok fleet, Mitchell's crew worked tirelessly to keep the ship operational under constant fire, their shields flickering and weakening with every strike. The enemy was down, but not out, and the Zarnok would fight to the very end. The human fleet was battered, but it remained standing. Mitchell's mind raced with every possible scenario. The Zarnok still had the numbers, and if they regrouped, they could turn the tide back in their favor. The remaining human ships had to make their attack count. The last chance to defeat the Zarnok was now, as the Valor closed the gap between itself and the Zarnok flagship. Mitchell felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Every decision, every order could determine the fate of humanity. "Lieutenant Hawkins, get us close enough to finish this," she said, her voice firm despite the gravity of the situation. Hawkins's hands danced over the controls with practiced precision. "Aye, Admiral, bringing us into range," he said. The ship groaned as it moved closer, every engine straining against the overwhelming pressure of enemy fire. Mitchell held her breath as she watched the Zarnok flagship looming larger ahead of them, its shields flickering in the wake of the previous attack. "Fire when ready," she commanded, her voice unwavering. The weapons officer hesitated only for a moment before unleashing the full power of the weapon. Once more, the beam of destructive energy shot out from the Valor and slammed into the heart of the Zarnok flagship with explosive force. This time, the ship shuddered violently, its outer hull cracked under the strain of the blast, and Mitchell knew the end was near. The Zarnok flagship began to split apart as the energy surged through its core, breaking it from the inside out. But the Zarnok commander refused to give in. He scrambled for control as his ship collapsed around him, screaming at his officers to hold the line. But his fleet was broken, and the Zarnok commander knew deep down that the battle was lost. The humans had done what no one had thought possible. They had fought back, and they had won. The Zarnok flagship finally broke apart in a violent explosion, sending shockwaves through the remaining enemy ships. But the battle was far from over. Mitchell's eyes never left the screen as the energy from the weapons surged through the crippled fleet around them. The Valor was battered, but still standing. The crew now working in overdrive to keep the ship intact. With every passing second, they could feel the weight of victory within their reach. But Mitchell knew better. This was a fleeting moment, and the Zarnok were not easily defeated. Status report. She barked, her voice cutting through the rising chaos on the bridge. The tactical officer glanced over at her, his face tense. Admiral, the Zarnok are in disarray, but they're regrouping, they're not finished yet. Mitchell's heart sank, but she didn't show it. Her mind was already working through the next move. The remaining Zarnok ships were trying to reorganize, but they were running out of time and options. Prepare all remaining fighters for another assault. She ordered, her voice firm. We finish this now. The crew sprang into action, coordinating with what little remained of the human fleet. The Zarnok had suffered a massive blow, but they still held a dangerous advantage in numbers. Mitchell's mind raced as she calculated their next steps. The weapon had done its job, but it was not enough to guarantee victory. The fight would continue until every last Zarnok ship was neutralized and Earth was free. Captain, bring us within firing range of their remaining command ships, she commanded. We finish them off before they can regroup. Aye, Admiral, the captain replied without hesitation as the Valor pushed forward. The remaining Zarnok ships were frantically trying to escape their encirclement, trying to break free from the grasp of the human fleet. But Mitchell could see the fear in their movements. The Zarnok were no longer in control of the situation. They had been broken by the sheer willpower of humanity, and now they were scattered like leaves in the wind. Mitchell's breath caught as she saw the opening she needed. The remnants of the Zarnok fleet were retreating, but it was too late. They had already lost their cohesion. Their ability to fight back was shattered. The remaining human fighters swooped in to finish what had been started. The sound of explosions filled the air as the fighters dove into the enemy ships, taking them down with precise strikes, each explosion a testament to the sacrifice of the people fighting to protect their planet. Mitchell clenched their fists as the final pieces of the Zarnok fleet fell one by one. The weapon had not only shattered their defenses, but had broken their spirit. The Valor pressed forward with relentless determination, its weapons tearing into the remaining enemy vessels. The Zarnok tried to retaliate, but their strikes lacked the coordination they once had. The remaining ships were no longer a threat. The tide had truly turned, and now it was just a matter of time before the last of the Zarnok forces were eliminated. Mitchell looked out the bridge's view screen as the last few Zarnok ships erupted into fireballs, their destruction final and absolute. The battle was over. The war was over. Earth had been saved. But as the crew cheered around her, Mitchell remained silent. She had led them to victory, but the cost had been immense. Humanity had sacrificed so much to survive, and the memories of those lost would never fade. She looked out at the stars and knew the fight had changed them forever. They would rebuild, but the scars of this war would never be erased. The bridge was quiet save for the soft hum of the remaining systems, the crew still processing what had just occurred. The war was over, but it didn't feel like victory. Not yet. The enormity of the cost still hung heavy in the air. Mitchell sat in her chair, her eyes staring blankly at the view screen. The remnants of the Zarnok fleet, now nothing but drifting debris. The human fleet had survived, but so many had fallen in the fight, so many lives lost in the struggle to protect Earth. The faces of those who had given their lives flashed before her eyes, the soldiers, the pilots, the civilians who had joined the resistance, every sacrifice weighing on her shoulders. The silence was broken by the voice of her first officer. Admiral, we've received a communication from Earth. Mitchell's heart skipped a beat as she snapped her gaze toward the comm station. Put it through, she ordered, her voice hoarse. The screen flickered to life, revealing a familiar face, General Carter, the leader of the Planetary Defense Forces. Admiral Mitchell, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know how to say this, but Earth is free. The weapon worked. We've driven the Zarnok off. Mitchell's throat tightened as the words settled in her mind. The war was over. Earth was safe, but the cost had been unimaginable. She swallowed hard as she replied. It was the will of every person who fought, General. Every sacrifice made was worth it. Carter nodded, his face somber. The damage to the planet is severe, but we're already starting to rebuild. The people are strong. They'll rise from this. Mitchell nodded, but the weight of it all pressed down on her like 1,000 tons. The battle was won, but it felt hollow. She had led them through the storm, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they had all lost something that could never be replaced. I'll be home soon, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter gave her a look of understanding, and the screen went dark. Mitchell leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion wash over her as she had led humanity to victory. but at what cost. The war had taken everything from them and left scars that would never heal. But as she sat there, she also realized something: the human spirit had not been broken. They had fought with everything they had and had emerged victorious. She could feel it in the air around her. The strength of humanity was undeniable. They had survived against all odds. They would rebuild, they would honor the fallen, and they would never forget the price they had paid. The crew had begun to celebrate their victory. But Mitchell remained still, her mind replaying every moment of the battle, the faces of those who had fought beside her, the names of those who would never return. She would carry their memories with her forever. But even in the shadow of loss, she knew that humanity's resilience was unmatched. They had fought for Earth and for each other, and now they had a chance to rebuild a future in the stars. Mitchell turned to Hawkins, who was standing by her side, his expression somber but resolute. "Prepare the ship for return to Earth," she said, her voice steady. "We've done our duty, but the work doesn't stop here." Hawkins nodded silently as he turned to relay the orders. The Valor would soon make its way back to Earth to join the rebuilding process. But the fight was not over. The true challenge now was to honor the fallen and ensure that the horrors of war would never be repeated. As Mitchell gazed out into the stars, she made a vow to herself and to those she had lost: humanity would rebuild, and they would rise stronger than ever before. The Valor made its way toward Earth, the stars outside the viewport a blur as they moved through the vast expanse of space. Mitchell stood at the helm, looking out at the endless night, a sense of finality settling over her. The war was over, the enemy was vanquished, but the journey ahead would be far from easy. The scars left on Earth, both physical and emotional, were deep, and it would take every ounce of strength to rebuild what had been lost. The sounds of the crew moving about the bridge were faint as Mitchell's mind wandered to the faces of those who had fallen, the ones who would never see the sun rise again, the soldiers, the civilians, the families that had given everything. She couldn't escape the weight of their sacrifices. But she also knew that in their honor, Earth would rise again. The crew had done what they had set out to do. They had fought and won. But Mitchell couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness inside her. She had led them through the darkest times, and yet the victory felt hollow. The price had been too great. But as the ship neared Earth's orbit, she could see the first signs of life returning to the planet. Green patches starting to appear as the recovery efforts began. The planet would heal, but it would take time and patience. Humanity had endured the worst, and now they would rebuild from the ashes of destruction. But Mitchell knew it wouldn't be easy. The damage to Earth was far-reaching. Entire cities had been destroyed, the environment had been scarred, and countless lives had been lost. The rebuilding process would take generations, and yet humanity's spirit remained unbroken. The planet was still standing, and the people still had hope. She turned to Hawkins, who was standing quietly beside her. "How long until we reach Earth?" she asked, her voice soft. Hawkins looked up from his station and gave her a tired but resolute smile. "A few hours, Admiral. We'll be home soon." Mitchell nodded, but the sense of finality still lingered. She would return to Earth and lead the efforts to rebuild, but she would never forget the cost of this victory. She would carry the memories of the fallen with her always. As the ship moved closer to Earth, Mitchell felt a shift inside her. She had been so focused on the war, on the fight for survival, that she had forgotten the importance of the peace that followed. The war had taken so much from them, but it had also given humanity a chance to prove its resilience, to show that no matter the odds they could overcome any challenge ahead. The Valor finally entered Earth's atmosphere. The familiar sight of the planet's surface below came into view. The land masses scared, but still full of potential. The ship began its descent toward the landing zone, the crew bracing for the final stretch of their journey. Mitchell stood in silence as they descended, her heart heavy with the weight of what had been lost, but also filled with hope for the future. They would rebuild, and this time they would never forget the sacrifices that had been made. The crew was silent as the Valor touched down on Earth. The ramp lowered, and the air was thick with anticipation. The first humans to greet the returning fleet were soldiers and civilians, alike, their faces a mixture of joy and sorrow, as they welcomed the returning heroes. But Mitchell's eyes didn't waver from the horizon, where the rebuilding would begin. She had led them through the fire, and now it was time for the next chapter in humanity's story. They would rebuild a new world, a new beginning for Earth, and they would remember those who had fallen and honor their legacy. With every step forward, the war was over and humanity had won, But the journey ahead was just beginning.